Alright guys, welcome back to week 5 of our service learning Common Good seminar. This week we're reading Tattoos on the Heart, and that's a book by Gregory Boyle, who's a Jesuit. See if I can get my pen here. Okay, so Gregory Boyle's a Jesuit priest, and what he does is he runs Homeboy Industries. So this is a place, it's kind of like it's a place for former gang members primarily to get jobs, men and women to get jobs and to get them back into society. The key concepts that we're going to be talking about here today are compassion, empathy, and sympathy. How are these related? What's the difference between them? I'll leave compassion till a little later because that's kind of what the whole book is about, really. But a lot of the chapters that we're looking at are about that. A quick definition of empathy. Empathy is actually putting yourself in the place of another person and feeling the same thing. So you're actually like in the mind of the other person. So in the place of the other. Whereas sympathy is something like relating to, feeling with. And compassion is related to both of these things, but it's more of like as opposed to simply just relating to or feeling with, it's actually entails a little more action. It's kind of like putting yourself with the other. It's like actually joining them physically, joining with. Okay, so one of the places where he talks about these at the very beginning is he's in a jail, he's in a prison, talking to these guys about sympathy, empathy, and compassion, and he asks them what their thoughts are on this. And they say that sympathy is when you hear somebody's mom died, and you go and you say, "Hey, I'm sorry to hear about your mom." Whereas empathy is hearing somebody's mom died and knowing what it feels like to have your own mom die. You know, my mom died too. To be able to feel with them in the same sort of experience. Now, compassion, on the other hand, is something that they relate to God. They say compassion is equal to God. So if we look at the Gospel of John, he says God is love. So what exactly is going on here? How is compassion being related to love? Well, for one thing, compassion is not equal to emotion. Compassion is actually an action. Jesus was moved with pity, and so he became human. To save his children. Okay? So it's actually a movement to action. And he illustrates this really well with some stories here. He's got a lot of great stories here in this chapter, in these chapters. And a lot of them are really funny. So one of the things you'll notice is that he's got a lot of humor and a lot of joy. And he finds a lot of joy in his life, even though there's a lot of tragedy. So a lot of the people he sees die on a very regular basis. They die way before their time. So one question we might ask ourselves is, how do we find joy in the midst of tragedy? The ultimate tragedy is death. But as Christians, we believe in the resurrection. And somehow that enables us to live life. So death is defeated. And we can live life with joy because of the resurrection. So that's something to think about. And a question we might ask ourselves, well, is that real? Is it true? How do we know if it's true? So is this true? Alright, so let's think about that for class. One of the other things that he talks about here is the difficulty of loving your enemy. So in this particular example, one of the kids that he gotten to know and to love was shot, and he found these guys who killed him. He met with them, I think, or at the very least came to know them. And the thing is, he's called to love those guys who killed this kid too. So loving an enemy is a really challenging thing. He said, "Kids I love, killing kids I love." One twist to this is you have to think about God's perspective. So God as Father. He sees every day his children killing each other. Kids I love, killing kids I love. So that's really complicated piece of the puzzle here. And the reason we do this is because God showed us this is how to do it. We're not naturally inclined to this, to love our enemy. In fact, we're inclined to hate our enemy, I think, if we're honest. And so we have to put a lot of work into becoming somebody capable of loving our enemy. And it's easy to say, but really hard to do. So one of the things you'll notice in here is he's got a lot of great stories. And a lot of them are really funny. I think one of my favorite ones is this kid, straight A's, and he got 2 C's, 2 B's, and an A. But one of the things that he's coming up against is in prison. It's actually a little easier for him to do well because he has some structure to his life. But as he's getting out of prison, the thing is he's going to go up against a really hard situation that's largely unchanged. Absent parents, mental illness, chaos, and dysfunction. And Boyle asks him, "Well, I bet you're afraid to be out, aren't you?" And the kid cries and he says, well, he doesn't say anything really, just he just cries and lets himself be embraced. And then he says, "I just want to have a life." So that's a really important thing that we'll be talking about, is having a life, being somebody. What does it mean to be somebody? Among other things, it means to have to realize you have dignity as a human being. Now, why is this the case? That's a question we might ask ourselves. Is this something arbitrary? Or is it something that's real? Is it actually kind of built into reality? The Christian would say that this is real because we're made in God's image, and that this is just built into reality. Whereas some might say, well, this is real because we make it so. We decide on this as a society. So those are kind of 2 different positions to evaluate, to think about. He's got a story in here about welcoming homeless into the church and being called a wetback church. He's also got some stuff in here about what it means to be a sinner. So one important connotation of the word sin and sinner is outcast, marginalized. And if you think about this from the Jewish perspective, from the Old Testament, those people who broke the Torah, so if you broke the law, broke the Torah, you would be sent away until you were cleansed or made right. So now there are situations where this seems kind of ridiculous, right? So if you eat, say you eat a lobster or something, and you break the Torah, and you get sent away for that, that seems kind of ridiculous. But there are actually a lot of situations where this seems to make sense. So say that you're a leper. Well, that's a highly contagious disease. If that leprosy spreads to everybody in the community, they're all going to die, or at least have pretty miserable life. So to send a leper away is not unreasonable. But it is harsh. So one of the questions for them would be, well, how do we temper this? Unfortunately, we're in a place now where we have modern medicine, where we don't fear as much getting sick, and we're able to actually cure leprosy with pretty easy medicine. But back then, it actually made some sense to keep lepers away. And in the same way, at Our Lady of the Road, it kind of makes sense to keep somebody keep somebody away who's causing harm. So this question might seem kind of obvious at first, but as you dig into the nuance, you start to realize, well, hey, this is not so obvious. There are good reasons to keep people away from community, and that's partly why we have to look at this question of, well, what characterizes sin? What is sin? One answer that I'd propose for you is that sin is something that goes against human flourishing. That'd be one answer to think about. So it's something that's an action, an idea, a movement against human flourishing. But also a sin against God. So also against God. All right, so the other stuff we have in here. We talked about this in class the other day, but there's a big, big, big difference between being somebody for somebody else, seeing them as a project, and seeing people as people. Being for others versus with others, seeing somebody as a project, seeing somebody as a person. And that has to do with not seeing them as something to be done, but someone to be encountered. So see someone to be encountered. Wow, my handwriting's terrible. Sorry. All right. What else we got in this? Okay, so we have another place here where he's talking about compassion, and we have this idea of being able to imagine lives that are not yours. So when you can imagine somebody's life that's not yours, you start to put yourself in their experience. You start to empathize with them. And when you start to empathize with them, you're able to kind of imaginatively put yourself in their shoes. And that moves you to compassion, which in turn moves you to love. So remember, we want to think about compassion as a verb. Think about this as an action. The final idea that I'm going to highlight here is this question of what does it mean to be somebody? So that comes up a lot in this reading. Well, it means to be loved, it means to be valued, it means to have dignity, to have your dignity acknowledged as a human person. Actually, one more idea in this. So what is communion? And why is it important? So he has this story about these people not receiving communion. What I would suggest as a quick answer to this is that communion is God giving himself to us so that we can become one with him. So it's all about making everything whole. Making whole and reconciling it. All right, I'm going to end there, and I look forward to seeing you guys soon. I hope things are going well, um, and I look forward to chatting with you about this. Okay, thanks. See you soon.